T watches a scary movie here. I appreciate you tuning in for another brand new episode. Don't forget to follow me on all of my horror channels where you can check out all the content I have coming out. You can do that by going to linktr.ee/T scary movie. That's my link tree. That'll give you access to the YouTube page for the video versions of the show. Hit subscribe to your favorite podcasting platforms for the audio only versions of the show. Hit subscribe wherever you're listening to my Letterboxd page where you can see my movie reviews and movie rankings throughout the year, and of course to my TikTok page for my short horror content, which includes premieres of movies I'm going to go see, as well as horror news and me just trying to be funny when I can be funny. Hit subscribe wherever you are watching, especially because, folks, this interview comes in two different formats. You might be watching the long version, which is going to be over an hour, which I love you for completing this interview because it's a great one. Or you might be watching the three-parter that I put up instead. And if you are, you're going to want to make sure to hit that subscribe button so you can get links to the subsequent part 2 and part 3 of this interview as well, which I'll also link at the end of this video. Either way, folks, enjoy my interview with Heather Wixson. This is T and Friends Watch a Scary Movie. Everybody, and welcome to another edition of T and Friends Watch a Scary Movie. I have a very special guest join me today, and so glad to have her here on the show. She is the author of such books as Monster Squad, celebrating the artists behind cinema's most memorable creatures, Monsters, Makeup, and Effects, Volume 1 and 2. She has written for Fangoria, Dread Central, and TerraTube, a co-host of the Corpses Club podcast, which is available on all your favorite podcasting platforms right now. And she's the former managing editor for Daily Dead. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Heather Wixson. Heather, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. That was like a really awesome intro. I'm terrible at like talking about myself, and I was like, oh, I did these things.
You've amassed a pretty amazing career in your time as an entertainment journalist there, so we got to give those accolades up for you now.
Thank you. It's strange. Like I guess it's sometimes like you can't see the forest from the trees where you're kind of in the middle of it, and you're like, when you step back, you're like, oh yeah, I guess I did some pretty cool stuff. That's awesome. So thank
Definitely.
you.
Yeah, of course. And so happy to have you on the show here. You know, it wasn't too long ago where you had announced like your retirement from like this profession. And I was like, nope, gotta jump on that like immediately because like so many people speak so highly of you, and having like read a lot of your work over like so many years now as well too. It's like, yep, absolutely have to jump on that to get an interview with her.
Thank you. I'm gonna try not to cry. But yeah, like it was just, I've been sort of in these circles now for about 17 years, and I'm just sort of mostly retiring from like the junkets, the reviews, and things like that. Like, I kind of want to get back to just like going to the movies because I just haven't had that experience in so long. And also too, like I just a few years ago I had to kind of take on a day job, and it's been a lot. And also just other book stuff going on. I'm gearing up to hopefully waiting to see how things are going with my day job before I move forward and I have a vacation. So I'm like gearing up to do like my very first like solo documentary project. Been a producer on documentaries. I've done a lot of special features on like a lot of indie releases. And I just was like, okay, I think it's like a now or never situation. And so I just felt like I was like ready to kind of take that next step. But it's been strange. Like it's seeing friends like right now at like different film festivals, and I'm like, the FOMO is so real.
Yeah.
But it's also for me, what's really exciting is like I've seen so much over the last 15 plus years where when I started out, like there was like maybe like 10 people that you kind of went to that were sort of like the quote unquote authority on things. And I will never call myself an authority on things, even though I know people kind of come to me for that kind of stuff, but I just can't do it. these days, what's so cool about how things have like really grown in terms of like the social media spaces and things like that, it's like there are so many exciting voices out there these days, and we're not getting the opportunities back when I was first starting. I mean, I think I can count on my on one hand how many women were sort of in these circles in horror at the time. Now I would say it's probably 50-50.
Yeah.
Just having more diverse voices out there as well. It really was like, and I mean, no offense to the guys who sort of were in it when I was there, but when I started, but like it was a total like white dude sausage fest. And it was really weird. And so to me, like getting to see all these different people be able to like carve out their spaces and talk about these things that they really love and care about, like I think that's awesome. Like for me, I was like, this community, this online community, this space, whatever you want to call it, is in a really good place now. I think like I just love being able to sort of discover new folks, see what people are writing about, coming at it from different perspectives. It's just really cool because again, when I started off, it wasn't like that at all. um, I wish it didn't come to the fact that people had to kind of make their own spaces. I wish the doors had been open a little bit, but that's sort of the nature of the beast. And I love that people weren't deterred and they were like, no, I want to talk about these things. I'm going to do it. And they did it. And it's cool. It's really awesome to kind of see the growth that we've had. Cause I've seen a lot.
Is there anything that you would attribute that to personally? Like, because you're right. I mean, looking at the space of the voices in the horror right now, we are getting much more, female representation. The plenty of women voices coming out there now, people of color as well too. Is there something that you've seen, or at least that you've noticed, that has shifted in your time doing this, that has brought those voices up? You feel?
One, I mean, it seems weird to say this, but I think a lot of it does come down to the publicists because I think back, in the 2000s, they were sort of working with like a very small list. And I also think too, now that like being able to like create websites is a lot easier to find like your audiences on YouTube and TikTok and things like that. Like I think it's really changed how a lot of like from the business side of things, how publicists and studios are valuing these different voices. Like it's not just the big three anymore. Like when I came in, I mean, it was Bloody Disgusting, Dread Central, Shock to Drop. Like those were the big three. FearNet was in there too, but they were a little different because they were their own like channel too, which was awesome. I miss FearNet
Yeah.
like every day.
Oh yeah.
I still have my FearNet mug that I got like years ago. And I know there's Fangoria, but back then Fangoria was more about the magazine. So getting to see how they've really pivoted as well, like with Angel and getting to see her out there and kind of representing the brand in a very different way than we'd seen from Fangoria. You can see the shift because the shift kind of comes along in like the mid 2010s. And that was when it was like, oh, we're really going to like allow people to kind of come in a little. And again, I'm not somebody who's ever going to really toot my own horn, but I've always been super duper open to talking to anybody and everybody who wants to be in this community, who wants to be part of this industry, who wants to do this kind of stuff. Because for me, that's like, we should be making room at the table for everybody. And that's like, I didn't realize like how much I did that until like I was talking to more people, but like, that's how I ended up at Daily Dead, is that I ran into Jonathan at Comic-Con one year, and it was while I was still at Dread Central. And I was like, oh, you're from Daily Dead. I was like, just started reading you guys. This is so cool. It was his first Comic-Con. And he didn't tell me this until like afterwards, but like, we basically had a lot of the same schedule where it was like, you go to these round tables, press conferences, you're doing this and that and going all over the place, so you're seeing a lot of different people. And like, afterwards, like when I eventually sort of joined up over at Daily Dead, he was like, he's like, you're the only person in the press circles who actually talked to me that first year at Comic-Con. And I was like, what? Like, that's ridiculous. But I've always like, if people are there to geek out over the same things that I am, like, why wouldn't I talk to them? I'm not better than anybody. Like, that's the thing. And so I think what's really cool is like, because again, you have people who are doing the writing, people who are doing hosting shows. It's like there's so many different ways to come at it now, where that wasn't the case when I started. Like, I think that's cool. There's like, hosting like a weekly YouTube show, I don't think I could do that really because I don't have that confidence. I can write like, a mofo, but I can't sit and like be like, hey guys, I'm going to talk to a camera for 30 minutes because I freak out. So I just like, so that's good. I don't need to be in that space. There's so many other people who are so much better at it, who really come at it with like passion and love and joy. And like, that's cool. You guys go for it. Like, I will be over here doing what I do. So yeah, so basically it's just kind of like these days, I know that area is good. It's covered. People got junkets on lockdown. Honestly, like when it comes to like reviews and stuff, my go-to person is actually Megan Navarro over at Bloody Disgusting
Yeah.
because she knows her stuff like so well. And one of my biggest regrets out of all of this is I'm not going to get to see her at things because I just adore her so much. And I think she has such a great aptitude for what makes a horror movie compelling. It doesn't have to just be about being scary. There's so much more to it. So it's like it makes me happy to see where we are because I know what it was when I came in and it wasn't easy. But I'm proud of everything that I've done. I'm like, I sit there and I think about it and I'm like, sometimes I'm like, oh, I did talk to them, or I got to go and hang out with so and so. And I was like, wow, like 8-year-old me who grew up like, I'm a kid from a trailer park outside of Chicago. Like, there was no expectations for my life whatsoever. I still think about that kid and I'm like, she would be like, what is this? Like, what did you do? And I still can't believe it. And I feel really grateful for the opportunities that I got. I feel really happy with the opportunities I had to make for myself because I worked really hard for those. And honestly, at the end of the day, it's all just about celebrating all this stuff that I grew up loving and the stuff that I continue to love. Because it was never about me. It was about the genre. And that's what drove me every day for all of those years. It was just being able to celebrate horror to the best of my ability. And even movies that I didn't love, I never phoned it in. Like, because that was just, that would be a detriment to the genre as a whole. So I just tried. I really did. That's such a long-winded answer.
It's a good one, though. It's a good one, and you hit something that I kind of got stuck on a little bit there. You're basically talking a little bit about gatekeeping, which is something in the horror community we see so much of. Like, there is an ample amount of gatekeeping in the horror community, and I love the fact that you're talking about that it should be open and it should be accessible to everyone. What do you think really drives like the gatekeeping that can exist, not just in horror, but I guess in a lot of fan spaces? Because I know, like, for example, you and I are both big wrestling fans, and there's definitely gatekeeping in wrestling as well too. What do you think drives like a desire for folks to say, this is all you can accept, and this is the only good thing that's in this whole realm? Like, what drives that to what you've seen at least?
Yeah, I think maybe it's a generational thing a little bit because like I grew up like being a kid who loved horror movies and loved wrestling. So I had to basically fight constantly with everybody about these things that I loved and I was passionate about because everybody always sort of talked down to me about them, talked about how stupid they were, like that it's garbage, it's fake, like so I've kind of grew up always fighting for these things where these days when you're like when you're sort of online and you kind of find something that you love, you feel like you kind of possess it a little bit. And I think it's just we build up like these sort of like litmus tests in a way online where it's like, well, if you don't love this then you're not really a horror fan, or like, I've been this fan since day one, you don't know as much as me. Like, it's weird. It's weird because I like, for as much as like, for example, like there's a joke because like since day one, I was a Scream 4 fan when everybody else, and there was so many people at the time, we're also talking like almost 13 years ago now, or actually, yeah, 13 years ago, because it was April 2011, who were just like crapping all over the movie, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, no, this movie like is really ahead of the curve. It bummed me out. So I was fighting for it a lot. And then slowly I see people kind of being like, oh, Scream 4 is actually really good. Wow, Wes was saying a lot of interesting things. Oh, this whole thing with Emma Ross, like, it was just interesting. And like, there's a part of me that wants to like scream for the rooftops and be like, I was here day one. What the hell? But here's the thing for me, I'm like, hey, this is cool. You caught up. This is great. Come join us. Like, we need more people to like celebrate these kind of things. So I do think that it might be from that mindset of like where I always had to kind of fight for it anyway. Um, and these days where it's just like somebody discovers something on the internet and they think they own it, and I don't think they just don't. And I think also too, like as horror fans, we're always kind of used to sort of being marginalized in a way. So there is something about when the normies kind of catch on to something, because like they go hard. It's funny because like I work with a couple of folks in my office for my day job who are younger, and like they're not horror fans, but they're A24 fans. And I think that's so interesting to me.
Yeah.
Because like I was ride or die as a kid for like New World Pictures or Canon, but I've never really seen it like to this degree where like they are like so deep for A24.
Like anything they're attached to.
Yeah, and part of me is kind of like, there's more, but at the same time I'm like, but at least you're watching. So that's kind of cool. Because like these are people that like last year, because they're like, oh, I love A24, I was like able to kind of convince them to be like, oh, you should go watch this movie called When Evil Lurks, because I think you'll really like it. It's kind of in there. My one coworker who's like really she's like, oh my god, she's like, we had to pause that movie like twice, and she was like, holy crap. I was like, yeah. She's like, but I loved it. She's like, that was great. I want more.
That's a win.
Yeah. So that for me, I was like, okay, cool. Like we're getting the normies to kind of come over to our stuff. So yeah, like gatekeeping to me is so dumb. Like I'm just like, why? Like are you getting money from this? Like no. Like then who cares? So yeah, I mean, I think it's just like internet culture, a lot of it. But yeah, I hate that stuff. Like it's it's counterproductive.
I love that the movie you suggest to a coworker and friend is When Evil Lurks. That is so good.
I didn't ease them into anything. And I was like, oh, you've seen like Hereditary and Midsommar? Okay, watch When Evil Lurks. You're cool. You're fine.
Like we're good.
Yeah,
I love
totally.
it. So, I mean, talking about your love of like horror growing up and being in these spaces, your latest book that you co-wrote with Patrick Bromley, In Search of Darkness, the definitive look at 80s horror. We have the 3-part documentary series, which is so good. It is such a great entry point, I feel, for anybody who might not have such a knowledge of horror and 80s horror at that. And it's such a perfect love letter because there's so many entries in there for movies that people know, and then a lot in there as well that even I myself like didn't know either, and it makes it such this great entry point. But I'm curious, with the documentary and now this book, which I'm so excited to get as well, what is it about 80s horror that like drives that pulls you into it? Because it seems to be like the era for horror. When you look back, you get a little bit of everything in there. What was it for you that built this love of 80s horror?
Yeah, I think I was lucky enough to kind of grow up during a time when like I grew up with a single mom, so babysitters were expensive, so she just brought me to stuff, and I was a pretty good kid in theaters. Like I think the only time we had an issue was like I just was losing my mind crying during ET the first time I saw it, because I mean, that was like earth shattering when you're like a little kid.
Oh yeah.
But typically, like I was pretty okay at movie theaters. So like one of my very first like memories that I kind of have that I still think about, like it's still in the back of my head, is like my mom took me to American Werewolf in London when I was 3, which is not a movie you take 3-year-olds to. And in fact, her best friend was with us, and she was a big scaredy cat. So at one point, she like leaned over to my mom. She's like, "I think Heather's getting scared. I'm going to take her into the lobby." And I was like, in retrospect now, I'm like, no, you were scared. I was cool. So it was just like, my childhood, I was just kind of like open to it. Like my mom watched it. My best friend, who lived 2 houses away from me, her parents watched a ton of like sci-fi horror. So that was like a really good, her parents basically showed us like The Thing at 5, which again is not a movie you watch when you're 5, especially like
Mhm.
shortly after. The worst part was shortly after I'd actually, or right before that, I'd actually been bit by a neighbor's dog. So,
Oh,
so between that and then seeing The Thing, I didn't trust dogs for a really, really long time. Because
understandable.
yeah, that was trauma.
Oh,
But yeah, it was just like, and then also kind of coming off of the cusp of the 70s horror and getting exposed to that kind of stuff too. I mean, it was cool because honestly, when back in the 80s, when you were a kid, you kind of watched the movies your parents were watching because that was like the option. I didn't really grow up around cable
mhm.
um, until the 90s because we just didn't have it where I lived. And so whatever your parents were watching, you were watching. But it was cool because then like video stores come along and then you get to go pick out your movie and do that kind of stuff. Um, and so you get to kind of like start feeling like you're like creating your own little journey. And for me, like it was honestly getting to see this one movie, and I wrote about it in the In Search of Darkness book, and it really is kind of like sort of the original In Search of Darkness, which was Terror in the Isles. And I was obsessed with this movie when I was a kid because it was like all these great clips. It was Donald Pleasance and Nancy Ellen, who I loved, sitting in the theater talking about not horror movies, but terror movies.
Mhm.
And but it was a really good entry point for me as a kid because like I would go to the video store and grab the Terror in the Isles box, and the skull on the front of the box is made up of movie titles. So I would go through and try to hunt all these movies down in the video store and like watch them. And for me, that was like perfect. And that's for me what I love about In Search of Darkness because I was a producer on the first installment, and then pandemic hit. I decided to go back to school. Thing like just too much going on, and I was like, I sort of stepped away for part 2 and part 3 in that capacity, but I was still in it. Um, but I love that idea of discovery. I love the idea of like people getting to like experience something for the first time, whether it's from the 80s, 90s, or now. Like it's just such a cool feeling, and I love being able to sort of maybe open the door a crack for people who maybe otherwise they may not have seen a movie or may not have heard of a movie. There's somebody on Twitter right now, her name is Sonia, and she's already like watching movies that she's never watched before because of the book. So she is always
Awesome.
tagging me and Patrick. So the first one she did was Just to Kill. She just did Sleepaway Camp
Oh,
last night. And I love it because
yeah.
also Sleepaway Camp for me was one of my favorite movies to bring to a sleepover because it would mess with everybody so badly. And my mom did get phone calls a couple times.
Uh-huh.
Um, there was one because especially my friend's dad walked in during the climax of the movie,
Got it.
so there was a phone call, there was a discussion, because my mom had no idea. It was just like, oh, you want to rent this movie? Okay, whatever.
It's like, sure, yeah.
um yeah, and then, oh, you want to bring this to the sleepover? Sure, we'll rent it. And yeah, so it was a little awkward, but that was like the cool of it and the cool part of it. And I think for me, like what makes 80s such a standout, um, I mean, I think every decade has their moments and it has a reason behind what makes it so great. But for me, the 80s, it just feels kind of almost like the Wild West, but in a good way, because you were getting big, like you were coming off of sort of this prestige horror boom of the late 70s. So you were still kind of getting some of those movies here and there, but you were getting, it was such a great time for independent production studios. And I think that foundation was laid by like guys like, Larry Cohen or Roger Corman, who showed that you didn't need to have $1 million to make a movie. You can go out there and make it with $10,000 if you really need to. Um, and that's how we ended up getting like guys like Bill Lustig or Frank Henenlotter. And it was just like, it was everything. Like people could really go out there and make anything and it would end up on video. And what's really cool too about like sort of the VHS movement of the 80s, and I don't know if a lot of people know this, but one of the sort of people at the forefront of that was Charles Band from Full Moon.
Mm.
You know,
Uh,
and say what you want about like his business acumen, like he's had some businesses come and go. I had a friend who worked for him basically for DVDs for 6 months and was like, I can't pay my rent with DVDs. I gotta go.
woo, nope.
Yeah, you know, but the guy knew that home video was like the next step in the evolution. And he was really good at being able to get movies out there without like that studio backing. because a lot of people might forget that like the original Halloween didn't come to VHS because Universal owned it at that point. So it's really cool. Like it felt like anything was possible back then. And, so like when you see like 90s horror, you're kind of, things sort of stepped back a little bit because the genre did sort of have a decline at the end of the 80s. There was a little bit of, quote unquote franchise fatigue. In 89, you had a Freddy, Jason, and Michael Myers movie. None of them did great. I don't think anybody would really call those like the best entries in the series either. So it was almost like you had to reset in the 90s. And I think also too, for as much talk as people want to say, oh, art isn't political or whatever, you really saw in the 90s a lot of movies that were coming out in response to something specific. Like, yes, we had They Live in the 80s. And, and it was interesting because it wasn't super specific. If you just went in going looking for a sci-fi movie, those who knew it was about Ronald Reagan and consumerism and the yuppie movement, everything like that.
Yeah.
Where 90s, it felt a little more directly reactionary in a lot of ways. There was a lot going on at that point where a lot of cultural shifts were happening. There's a lot of not great cultural shifts as well. And so you kind of had horror pushing back against a lot of that stuff. And then 2000s, once you kind of get after 9/11, like you get the quote unquote movement that everybody calls, and I hate this term, but they call it the torture porn. I frankly call it American extremism because we were so desensitized, I think, collectively. And it was also, we were seeing what was going on in France with a lot of their films, and we kind of glommed onto it because that's what we do. So it's like, it's such a cool, for me, 80s, it just was like, you could find something for anybody. Where 90s, it was kind of like, okay, hopefully you guys are going to like this, but there's so many like, there's so many cool things that happened in the 90s, but the 80s, it just felt like consistently, like, especially like doing this book, doing the research and seeing what was coming out every single week, all on all these different levels. It was like genuinely, like almost at any given time, there was like 3 to 4 different horror movies in theaters at almost every week. Like, that's so cool. Like it was a great time to be a fan.
See, and I'm curious because I love the fact that you mentioned like the VHS boom as well, and the way that video stores really kind of built that up. There's a lot of talk about streaming these days and about like what it's doing to the film industry, and there's merits on both sides of that. But I feel that when it comes to horror, especially, it almost seems a lot like the VHS days of the late 80s, early 90s, because especially in the world of indie horror, it's giving all these other films like a chance to be seen and a chance to thrive. And I'm curious if, for all the negativity that's out there about streaming right now, how you feel about it when it comes to horror.
Yeah, I always see there's sort of the streaming versus physical media conversation. It's endless. It's like, oh, it's been 3 days, let's have this conversation again. But so I think for me, like I'm somebody who's always going to appreciate physical media, but I also enjoy what streaming does for accessibility, because it doesn't mean like these days, it's not like we can go into, like, a lot of people don't have access to video stores. That's just not a thing. Like, I live in LA, so I'm lucky. So we have sort of these fun niche, video store experiences. Like Vidiot's recently reopened last year, and they were able to do a video store as part of like their setup. But I know somebody in Oklahoma doesn't have that same thing, where in the 80s they did. So for me, like getting people more access, I don't think is a bad thing. Like I do see, like, we're all sort of oversubscribed to things at this point, like where it's like, we did this because we were trying to get away from cable. Now we're all spending way more than we ever were on cable, because we're on Max, we're on, Paramount, we're on, Netflix, we're Hulu, all this. So I think for me, one of the things that I do think is really cool though, is that you get stuff like Tubi, and like having access to that kind of a library for free is really amazing. And I can't hate on that, because like there are so many times where like I have to watch some weird obscure movie. It's out of print on disc. It's not available to purchase through other means, I'll find it on Tubi though. Like I had to like years ago, I had to watch Santa with Muscles, which is this really terrible, yet I love it, but it's terrible like Christmas movie with Hulk Hogan as
Yeah.
Santa. You know, which of course Hulk Hogan himself is already a complicated topic as it is. You know, but at the same time, I was like, okay, well, what am I going to do? It's not on Amazon. What? How am I going to find this? It was on Tubi. So I do think like it's very short-sighted to think it's an either or situation because I don't think it is. But I do think that there is something inherently messed up about what's going on with streaming these days. And I think a lot of the streaming services are starting to see the fall off where like, yeah, we were all really eager to subscribe to these things, but guess what? Like existing is now 3 times more expensive than it was like 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Like, so people are going to have to start making cuts. That's why you're seeing, I think it's like, they're talking about like merging HBO and Paramount, which I mean, honestly, for me, that'd be cool. Because what I like it, like, you know, as much as like you want to hate on streaming services, what's cool about Max is like, you get access to Turner Classic Movies on there too. So it's not just like the big movies that they're putting out like Wonka or Aquaman. Like you're getting to go into and like find like older movies that again may not be as accessible. Like I was working on a project and I had to find Brian De Palma's Sisters, which is a fantastic movie. Really, really love that one a lot. And it was on HBO Max because of Turner Classic Movies. I'm not going to find that on Netflix. I'm not going to find that, you know, I don't think it was on Tubi either because it's a little bit like artsy kind of weird stuff. And so, you know, it's like, I never want to say either or. I get it though, because there are times where like, I'll go to look to stream something just because it's easy. I'm on the couch, my dogs are sleeping on me and I don't want to move and it's not available. And I'm like, oh, now I have to go get my disc, you know? So it's the lazy factor too. But like at the same time, like I know for somebody who's like, you know, living paycheck to paycheck and they just want to keep up on fun horror movies or watch this or that or discover old ones, like having access to things like Pluto TV or Tubi is a godsend. Like honestly, like because of COVID, like when COVID hit and everything was shutting down and like we were like, okay, well, we have to make major cuts across the board. So we turned off like TV stuff. Pluto TV was like our go-to for 8 months straight because it was like specific channels for specific things. I love watching old game shows, so that like really hit me. I was like, I can almost like after watching it for weeks and weeks and weeks, I could pretty much tell you the entire run of like how the Addams Family like worked out because like I was just watching that channel all the time, and they have movies too. So like I think there's a really sort of fine line between understanding the importance of physical media because it always is going to be important. You know, as we see, you know, more and more studios like either not putting new movies out on release or doing a very limited thing and then oops, that's it. But also being able to give more people the opportunity to discover movies through streaming. And I also think too, like having something like Shudder, you know, has made a huge difference in terms of independent horror because in like the 2010s, you know, before Shudder even existed, if you were an independent horror movie, good luck making noise, good luck finding an audience. Because there wasn't like you just had to go straight onto like regular VOD, buy it on demand. That was that. Yeah. So in that regard, like things like Shudder or Screambox that became sort of these champions of more diverse movies, again, is a really good thing. So, you know, I will never be an either or, but I get it both ways. But also too, like there is something about holding something in your hand and knowing you own it, and somebody can't take that away from you too.
I love your answers because like I feel like you're feeding right into like all these other questions that I have because I literally was going to ask you something.
We're in
We are
sync. That's
totally
all.
in sync right now. And I love the fact that you talk so much about indie horror because we're in a world of high profile remakes, reboots, sequels, but we're also getting movies like Skidamarink, like The Outwaters, like we're all going to the World's Fair, Watcher, and they show that indie horror is thriving just as well as mainstream horror, if you want to use that name. And I know you have such a passion for the independent scene. Why is it important for folks to not just check out the high profile new sequel, reboot, franchise starter that's out in theaters, but also to check out just as many indie horror flicks as well too?
I think for me, it's always been because it's real. I mean, also, admittedly, right now we're getting studios taking a little more risks with their movies, so that's kind of cool. But I know, again, when I was sort of really kind of carving out my niche in sort of the online journalism space, there were so many people who just, because it wasn't a title that was going to give them the clicks that they were looking for, it wasn't like the high profile things that people were like, oh, here's 15 different articles bagging on the Nightmare on Elm Street remake. Okay, cool, we get it. But that wasn't interesting to me. And because as somebody who grew up loving so many different independent film houses, we don't have a Nightmare on Elm Street under a studio system. We have a Nightmare on Elm Street because Bob Shea basically leveraged all of the money that he had made through distribution in the 80s to give Wes Craven $1.1 million to go make a Nightmare on Elm Street. And then they did a subsequent indie rollout for it. It wasn't a big studio movie back then. So to me, the indies, again, I think it sort of feeds also into the horror genre. It's a genre for underdogs, right? And I love a good underdog story. And so for me, I, especially being so fortunate to live in LA and getting to go to different film festivals and seeing what filmmakers in the independent space were doing, I was like, there's some really cool stuff out here. Why aren't we talking about this more? And that was honestly one of the reasons in 2011, it was a weird sort of convergence of circumstances where I was working a day job. I was actually working at a special effects shop. I ended up getting shingles. It was weird. My partner, his mom had just passed away. I got shingles. My boss decided to fire me. I was kind of laid out for months. It was just I need something to do with my time. And I was and then I was kind of seeing the boss that I was working for at Dread Central, even though he was oh, I'm Mr. Independent Horror, he was not. Because I had to constantly fight with him about making sure that we were covering these titles. And I was like, okay, fine. You don't want to do this. What if I create Indie Horror Month and make it into a thing? Because I was there should be something out there that is championing these folks who are the next wave of filmmakers. And one of those people ended up being Mike Flanagan, because he came to us with Absentia when I think it was the second year of Indie Horror Month. So that would have been 2012. And he was like, hey, I got this movie. And I was totally blown away. And I was like, this guy is going to do something. I just knew it, in my heart. This guy loves horror. There's something here that, he's going to do some shit. That was my thing. I don't know if I can swear, so I did that very soft. And so for me, that was the coolest thing ever, was getting to sort of see this side of the genre where people were taking risks, who were really making movies with their friends, and you feel that passion and you see people coming at it with new ideas, because studio horror is really cool right now. It wasn't that cool in the early 2010s, that's for sure. And I think a lot of what you're seeing now is a response to that. One of the biggest movies to kind of come along that sort of changed things was Insidious. That was totally independent, because Blumhouse at that point wasn't Blumhouse as we know it. That was a huge risk for them at that point. And that was basically James Wan and Lee Winnell having to totally reset their careers because of the responses, which were totally wrong, to movies like Death Sentence or Dead Silence, two movies that I personally love.
Oh, they're so good.
It's funny because I would get to interview James a bunch of times after that, and I'd always fight with him over dude, Dead Silence rules, and he's like, no, it's okay, you don't have to be nice. And I'm like, I'm not being nice. Mary Shaw is great. you know?
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, so getting to sort of see a lot of these folks kind of coming into this space, it's just like ridiculously cool. And you've got these guys now that are like in charge of huge movies. Like Adam
Yeah.
Wingard is a guy who basically, I think Pop Skull was made for like $5,000.
Mhm.
And I remember the first time I got to interview him was 2011. It was for A Horrible Way to Die. I think we actually did include that in our first Indie Horror Month celebration. And like the dude just put out a huge Godzilla Kong movie. Like, oh
Yeah.
my God. You know, so getting to see that kind of stuff is so amazing. And like another one for me, I was really fortunate in 2013. I got to actually do like a little festival at a movie theater because I used to go back to Chicago to co-host Flashback Weekend there.
Okay.
And Mike, who runs Flashback Weekend, he works with like a theater chain, and they had a theater out here in LA. And he was like, "Hey, if you ever want a theater for a weekend, let me know." And I was like, "Really? Like, when do you get that kind of opportunity?" And
God.
it was a pure labor of love. I was just like, "Okay, who's got movies? What movies have I seen recently that I love that I want to put on a big screen?
Mhm.
You know, let's make some space for some shorts. Let's do like have some fun." And that was like one of the greatest feelings ever. Like every time I would walk in a theater and a new movie was on the big screen, I got emotional. And it was such a cool feeling to be able to kind of give a lot of folks who may not have gotten that opportunity the chance to get it. And then also too for me personally, because one of the movies that really gave me like that feeling when I was watching stuff um on the independent side of things was Resolution from Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead.
Mhm.
And I knew when I did this, I was like, I need to put Resolution on a big screen. I was like, this blew my mind. It changed my DNA a lot. And I knew immediately from that movie, like anything these guys do, I'm watching. Like I'm in 100%. And I still think about like that experience. And it wasn't like a huge crowd because it was like Saturday night. Like it was really hard to kind of promote it as it was. But we worked really hard. I did it by myself. Like it was a total labor of love. I got nothing out of it except getting to give people a place to sort of show their stuff. And I will tell you, like, the greatest feeling for me was after Resolution finished, and there was like this couple that came out and they bought tickets on a whim. They hadn't even been to any of the other movies.
Mhm.
They just happened to be like, "Oh, let's go see a movie. Oh, what is this Resolution?" And they watched it and they were like, "That was the coolest thing I've ever seen.
Oh, that's
This is,"
awesome.
and they were like, "We're going to go look up the other movies because is it all like this?" And I just like, I don't know whatever happened to them. They weren't horror people. They just kind of showed up on a whim. And I was like, I was so excited. I was like, oh my God, like that's the cool feeling. And I love, like, for me, that was the greatest sort of gift back to me in this space was when I could like talk about something that I genuinely love and somebody would be like, I watched this movie because of you and thank you. Or like, that was really cool. And I'm going to go watch this. Like, I just love that feeling because I certainly was never in this for the money, you know? Um, Getting to hear from people who like, I might have just turned them on to something that they may not have seen otherwise is like the coolest thing ever.
Yeah.
And that's, that was what I loved. And so like, as I was driving home that night, because Resolution was like the last movie we showed, and I just like got super emotional. I was thinking about it. I was like, that was so cool. Like somebody's, I don't want to say life, but somebody's like experience change because they got to see this movie that they
Yeah.
never would have seen otherwise. Like that's rad.
Mhm. And you talk about like that. That's such an awesome experience getting to curate something like that, and to like just to put together an experience because it really is an experience that somebody's honestly gonna take away for like the rest of their life. Because obviously, again, that's something that they would have never seen any other way, and you set that experience up. And that makes me want to go back to the book in Search of Darkness. How do you guys curate that list? Like, how do you get that down to choose just the entries that you have in the book? Because I mean, it's one thing for the documentary. You got to do like multiple parts for that, but how do you narrow that down to this book with the entries that you include into it?
That's a good question, and I wish I had a more fancy answer. But honestly, it just came down to the movies that were featured in book in volume 1 and 2 of the doc. Because we actually started this like a few years ago before part 3 had actually gone into production. And so basically it was like, here's a list of 142 movies. I think there was a point where we thought we were going to add in 3 and we realized, no, we got to just deliver this thing. We just got to birth the baby and get on with it. Because it was a huge undertaking. And so it was just kind of that. But I think what was cool about it was like, I think a lot of folks have asked like, okay, so the documentaries exist. Why would I want the book? Right. And I get it. I totally get it. It's not a cheap book. I'm a horror fan on a budget too. So like, why would I want this book on top of being able to just watch the documentaries whenever? And for me, what I really wanted this to be was turning it into an extension. Like, it's almost like the director's cut of the first 2 In Search of Darkness documentaries, because like you're kind of limited in a way with those docs where like you can't go 20 minutes on every movie. You have to kind of get in there, kind of do what you need to do and get out to get on to the next movie. Otherwise, you're going to have a 10-hour doc. Yeah. So for me, what I didn't want to do anything that had already been done in the doc when we were writing. And I purposefully, doing research and doing everything, like I didn't go back and watch the docs at all because I didn't want to be repetitive, which then ultimately ended up biting me in the butt because I ended up being repetitive. In Night of the Comet, because I was actually going back to an interview that I had done with the director and Kelly Maroney for Night of the Comet. I was like, oh, I'm going to share this fun story. And then legitimately, when they brought us the quotes that are featured in the book from the doc, it's literally like verbatim a story in that section. I was like, we don't have any other quotes. And they were like, no. And I was like, okay, well, I'm not editing my chapter because that's going to throw everything off. We're past that at this point. But yeah, I just wanted to give people a little more context, a little more backstory, a little more perspective. For me, the book is about context, about what was going on in the 80s. Why were these movies happening the way they are? Like, if you look at like what horror was in 1980 versus 1984, you can see a clear trajectory away from, again, sort of that high level studio stuff with like The Changeling or Ghost Story, which were like in a response to like stuff like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Rosemary Baby, like The Exorcist, The Omen, where you're kind of getting into more like pop culture kind of stuff and things like that. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to never the intention of redoing the doc, but just taking it a little further and giving people a little more, especially for the people who came to In Search of Darkness, who may not have really known much about the 80s horror movies that were happening at the time. Like, honestly, like, as much as I'm like older and stuff, like, this is a great book for somebody in their 20s. Like, it might seem intimidating to go back. In fact, I do actually have a coworker who because our parent company is in Japan, and he actually just moved to New York to be with his wife from Japan. And he's like always asking me about like, oh, tell me more about American horror. What should I watch? Where should I start? So then when I was like on work Slack and I was like, hey guys, guess what? The book that I've been working on is going up for pre-order. He pre-ordered it because one, he didn't have to bug me about like trying to give him recommendations anymore. Cause I'm just like, well, what do you like? Like, are you looking for funny? Are you looking for scary? Are you looking for this or that? Like, I could give you 20 different movies and they could be totally different things. So he's been actually kind of going through it and really learning a lot about stuff that he had no access to when he was younger. So yeah, I think there's like, I wanted the book to be accessible enough for somebody who maybe doesn't know a lot about the genre, but also a really great in-depth celebration for people who've been watching this stuff their entire lives. And it was a really tough line to walk. And I never wanted, like, even movies that I wasn't super passionate about, I never wanted to phone it in for that, because they still deserved to be celebrated and recognized. And I know Patrick did the same thing. I made sure, because I got to be able to be the one who sort of divvied up who took on which movies. And I know what Patrick is passionate about. I know where his strengths are. he's got a lot more strength than me. He's been doing it a little bit longer. And so I really kind of fed into that where I'm like, look, I'm always going to write about Poltergeist because Poltergeist is like huge for me, but he is the Tobe Hooper guy. So like everything else, Tobe is all him always. Like I'm not writing about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre too. That's all him. So it was really fun to be able to kind of like play to our strengths, maybe discover some new movies along the way. And then again, really going to champion like a bunch of different types of movies because like, you know, in the same breath of like doing Ghost Story or doing Changeling with like George C. Scott, like I'm writing about Maniac and like, you know, one of the most like weirdly sadistic movies of the early 80s, but it's like so influential and it's so good. Or like I'm wearing my Dead and Buried shirt, which is like one of my sort of favorite cult movies, that like a lot of folks may not know about, but like I adore it. Like I love like Gary Sherman approaches the story. I love that cast. Love the special effects from Stan Winston, which was prior to him having like his big Stan Winston studio. This is still pre-Terminator. So he's still kind of doing his thing in a very unique way. So yeah, like it just was like, it was such a blast to get to like dive into these movies and really just not rehash a bunch of stuff that these fans of the documentaries have already seen. Because like if I do that, what's the point?
Yeah.
You know, that's boring. But that's not me. I'm never gonna do that.
Was there one particular entry that stood out to you that is like you're so happy to bring attention to it for people who had maybe never seen it before? Like anyone at all, even if it was like two, like if it's one that everybody knows, but was there one that just like, oh yeah, I'm so happy we get to feature this. Not a lot of people know it. Anything that come to your mind from the book now?
Yeah, I think the big one for me, and it's a movie that I've spent most of my life championing because it's like I just love it. Like, so the 80s, we were so lucky to have a lot of really great vampire movies. And I love vampire movies.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like, you know, you have the people like obviously Lost Boys, big one, huge. It's, you know, it's where it is because it rules so hard. Fright Night was a huge movie for me growing up because it really, like, it just sort of changed my perspective of what horror was at the time. I loved Roddy McDowell. William Ragsdale was like, oh, I love Charlie Brewster so much as a kid. The whole cast is great. The story is great. I feel like over the years, because it's become sort of this like cult, hard to find movie, like Near Dark has sort of found its place. And I'm obsessed with Catherine Bigelow. So that's like totally, you know, the thing. But for me, like getting to write about Vamp, which especially now, if anybody watches like The Last Drive-In, like since they showed Vamp, like Joe Bob just bagged on it and like in really big ways. And I was like trying to not personally be offended, but I was personally offended. I was like, what? Like, I forget what we were just watching on the most recent episode where Darcy was like, wait, you're championing this movie, but you were this hard on Vamp? Which I think is totally valid because I'm like, for me, Vamp was like one of the best discoveries I had as a kid because I just rented it basically based on the artwork alone. And yeah, it's like a sexy movie with vampires and strippers. We don't have From Dusk Till Dawn without Vamp. But it was like, I loved growing up Chris Makepeace. I was like obsessed with Meatballs was a huge movie for me as a kid. I'm so dating myself. There's like people in their 20s that are like watching this and they're like, what is this old lady talking about?
But treasure trove.
Was like, yeah, Meatballs was like huge when I was a kid. Like Bill Murray, like bunch of like up and coming young talent. So I loved Chris Makepeace. I adored Geddy Watanabe, and what I loved about him in Vamp is that he's not playing a stereotype. And up until that point, I'd only seen him in very stereotypical roles, whether it was 16 Candles or Gung Ho. Good movies definitely haven't aged the greatest, but I really liked him as an actor. So getting him to see him in this and being just a normal rich kid, like, okay, that's cool. Obviously, Robert Russler coming off of like Nightmare 2, Weird Science, like that was pretty cool. And like Grace Jones at that point was like such a phenomenon coming out of like James Bond world.
Yeah.
I think at that point, yes, she was, because like the statue that she does her little dance on is actually a body cast of Dolph Lundgren. Like her and Dolph Lundgren were kind of like the it couple at that point too.
Mhm.
And it's just like this wonderful like amalgamation of all these things that I absolutely adore. It's horror comedy, it's sexy, it's got great music, it gives you some unexpected twists. It just kind of keeps coming at you. And but it also like felt like it had a reverence for like the old days, like old, Vegas, where he's like, that's Vegas, that's class, it was to be able to like champion Vamp over the years, but then also get to like officially celebrate it here in this book in like some sort of an official way. I was like, yes, like this is a dream come true. So it was like just getting those little opportunities. So yeah, like that was like probably the movie. So like years ago, like after I did the first year of the festival, like the second year we lost the theater, but we still did stuff at Elric, who is on Colors of the Dark podcast. He used to have a cafe in LA called Jump Cut. And so they would do screenings and events and stuff. So I actually brought the second year of that festival to Jump Cut, just pared it down, made it really small. So like the first night we showed The Fog, and I was able to get John Carpenter out.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, which was like everyone's like, oh my God, what? So John came out for that. And then the third night we did Hellraiser. And I actually got to surprise everybody with Doug Bradley because he was in town doing a convention, but we couldn't announce him because he had like a no compete with the convention. So we snuck him over. But in between that, on that Saturday night, we got to show Vamp. And I'd gotten friendly with Robert Russler, and I was like, I just want to do this. I want to celebrate it. I love New World Pictures. Like, this to me was like the quintessential New World Pictures movie of the 80s. And he was like, I got you. We're going to do this. And so he was able to like pull it together where like we got the director, Richard Wenk, out. Edie Pfeiffer showed up. Producer Donald Borchers, who was a hugely instrumental figure at New World Pictures at that time, came out. The editor was there. It was like a dream come true. Like Donald brought me like an original one sheet. It was just like magic. And so like it was just kind of like getting to write about it now, like felt like everything kind of came full circle. And I was like, yeah, like somebody out there might actually go watch this movie because I wrote about it. I hope they do. Like I Vamp for me, I love it so much. Like it's one of those I have to shut myself up now because I will just ramble on about Vamp for another 30 minutes. And we have wrestling this afternoon, so we can't do that.
That's right. Oh man, that's coming. Which, speaking of, and we're gonna get there. So we're getting towards the end of it here, and I'm curious what all the articles, the reviews, the podcasts, the film festivals, your time doing all of this had to be like such a fun, glorious grind. I'm sure there obviously weren't the best of times with it as well too. But what advice would you give to like the next generation of creators that are looking to lend their voice to this world? Because what you've accomplished is impressive, and you've talked a lot about how like the space has definitely changed in your over the years here. What advice would you pass on to those who are looking to enter this kind of world as well too?
It's a good question. I think for me, like, look, I'm somebody who kind of grew up loving journalism. I really was. Like, I actually, in my elementary school, I helped start our newspaper, which was called a friend of mine who, like, she now works for the Supreme Court of all things. But she was like the one who named it. It was like, because our elementary school was like Richard E. Bird. So we called it A Little Bird Told Us. Told me, and that was the name of our little elementary school newspaper. But I was part of that because writing for me was something that I was hugely passionate about from a very early age. In fact, my best friend's parents like actually had to put their typewriter away because I kept tearing through their typewriter tape, which wasn't cheap back then.
No.
And so eventually my mom bought me one, but it was like a kid's typewriter and I was not impressed. I tried to use it. I was like, this is not good. I need the real thing. And so like, I just knew I always wanted to write. And there were times in my life where I put it on hold because I was kind of like, that's what you did. But journalism was always huge to me. Like I did stuff in middle school, high school, I did as well. In fact, one of my teachers in high school was so amazing who my freshman year, because I just transferred out into that district. So they didn't really know what to do with me. Like I was taking math classes that I'd already done in middle school, and like, because I was like in advanced stuff, and they were like, that's freshman year, they just didn't know what to do with me. And my English teacher freshman year, she saw something in me, and she was like, "Hey, you're not on our staff, but you should be," which was actually like a class. And she was like, "We're going on this field trip. I want you to come with us." So I was the only non-staff person who went up to this really fun conference for high school students for journalism in University of Wisconsin Whitewater. And actually, that was when I met Roger Ebert was there, which was so cool. And another person who was like a really big fixture in like Chicago journalism was Carol Marine. And so I got to like watch her talk about things. And I just always really loved it. I went to like journalism workshop camps over the summer, like a nerd. And I loved it so much. It was at Ball State University, which is where David Letterman went. And I actually really wanted to go to Ball State for journalism, but like everybody back then was like, you can't go, journalism isn't a job, go be a teacher and stuff, which there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, there's part of me that kind of wishes I'd done teaching because I really enjoy being a part of that process. But honestly, it was like I went to school for a little bit and then had to like not go to school because my mom screwed a lot of stuff up. And so I had to come back home. And then I just kind of was like, okay, now I work office jobs. And I started working in offices full time, like at 19. So I kind of put a lot of that stuff on the back burner. And then it was like, you did the thing that everybody does, like you get married, you go get your house, this again, in the 90s, 2000s, so things are a lot different these days. And so I was doing the life that everybody else thought I should be doing. And I got to a point where I was like, this isn't me. This isn't what I wanted. And I think if you're somebody who's genuinely passionate about exploring why you love these things or giving yourself more insights into the things that you love, like this is the perfect place to do it. And the one thing that I would tell anybody doing is like, yeah, it's cool to read and watch things that other people are doing, but never let that like influence who you are and the voice that you're trying to establish. Because that's the thing for me is like, when I set out, yes, there were people that I was reading and that I looked up to, but I never tried to be them because I was never going to be them. And like, I've just always 100% been me. And that's all I can ever be. Like, I'm never going to pretend to be hoity toity in terms of like certain things. I'm never going to talk down to audiences. I'm not putting in $2 words into reviews because I think it makes me look better. In fact, I probably make some of the dumbest jokes in some of my reviews because I'm just like, it's these goofy things that pop into my head. And I'm like, yeah, that's funny to me. Like, I don't know if somebody else is going to get it. But hopefully they do. And for me, authenticity is everything because I think so many people, especially these days, as we watch more people online, we read more people's work. Inauthenticity, like when you're non-authentic in what you're doing, people can tell. They're gonna come. They're gonna see that, and they're gonna know that you're. It's all BS. And then what do you got? Like then you've got no career, and you've basically destroyed any hope of having one because you've already proven to people that you're not coming at it from the right space. And I've always said to people, like, I never wanted to be the biggest. I just wanted to be the best at being me. And that's all I ever strive to be because the sites that I've worked for were never going to be bloody disgusting. And I have so much respect for what Brad has built at Bloody Disgusting over the years and doing it on his own terms and being able to take that audience and then also turn it into this really great hub for independent filmmaking in a very different way through the VHS movies and other projects and stuff like that. And then ultimately bringing that into Screenbox again, like I mentioned earlier, like I was never setting out to be the next Brad Miska because Brad's got that edge that I just don't have. So what does that mean for me? What am I going to bring to the table? And all I can bring to the table is me. And so I don't think you're somebody like who has to endlessly study things. In fact, for me, some of my favorite things are when like people are like, oh, I just discovered this cool movie from like 1986. And then they talk about it like it's sort of this reaction, like that's cool. Like that's what we should be doing. We shouldn't be like, well, you can't write about something because you haven't known it for 25 years. That's crap to me. Like that's not, no, that I don't, I don't need somebody to be an authority on every single thing they write about. But if I don't see that if they're not connecting to it without admitting that they're not connecting to it, then that's the thing. Like, just put your heart out there. Like, maybe in a different way than I did, because like, it wasn't always easy. And like, there were times, like, especially like when I worked at Dread Central, like I didn't want to do worst of lists. I hate those things. They were stupid to me then. They're stupid to me now. And that audience back then, like, ridiculed me for it. My editor basically was like, no, you need to do it. Like, it wasn't who I was as a writer and as a fan of this genre. And I think I did it once and I was like, this is so stupid. So like, I really think if you really work at it, and I read stuff that I wrote when I first started out versus now, and I'm like, oh, I was like, wow, I have come a long way. Every year I always go back in August and read my very first review, which was for the third remake, I think it is now, or no, the second remake, The Invasion, which is the Nicole Kidman, Daniel Craig movie. That was my very first review. And I always read it because it's a humbling thing. It is a very humbling experience where I was just like, I'm still proud of it, but I'm like, I've come so far. And I think if you're willing to like put in the work, always striving to make yourself better and really learning more and embracing more, like you can do anything really. Because I didn't come into this because like I came from money or I came from connections or anything like that. Like, honestly, me going to Dread Central was a total accident because I remember it was Sundance 2009 and there was a movie that was playing there that I'd been covering. And I remember like a few months before Dread Central was like looking for writers, I sent them an email. I pitched myself to them and I was like, this would be cool. Never heard a word back. And then I go to Sundance. And at that point, they weren't very open to like genre outlets like they are now. I know I was still like such a newbie. So I actually just went and bought tickets for screenings and just went and then wrote about them because I wasn't expecting to go in there to get a free pass and all this stuff. I was like, okay. Also, I was in the middle of a divorce. So I was basically selling off stuff to finance my trip to Sundance. Yeah. And while I was literally packing to come home, and the editor was like, hey, are you at Sundance? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, oh, do you want to do some stuff for us? And I was more there to cover for TerrorTube because that was my site. So I was like, yeah, I can do some stuff for you guys, but my priority is going to be TerrorTube because that's what I'm here for. But it did open the door for me to getting over to Dread Central. But it wasn't because like I was in any club. I didn't like move out to LA with a ton of money thinking I was going to live off of like some sort of cash. Like it was arduous. Especially because like I moved out to LA with like, I got hired. I went out on vacation, got a job, went home, packed up in 5 days and moved back out. And then literally in a month and a half, the school I was working for lost one of its like financiers. And so I was out of a job. Now I'm living in LA on my own with like friends, but not a ton of friends, not family. Like I couldn't just go move home with my mom. Like I was stuck, I was like, okay, what am I going to do? So it's never like, nothing that I had ever came from a place of like, it was all sort of established. I had to kind of make the paths for myself. And so for anybody out there who's like thinking that they don't see a path for themselves, make it, because you can do that. You really, really can. It's going to take work. It might take a little bit of sacrifice. Like honestly, the In Search of Darkness book meant I had no social life for like 2 years. Like the only social life I had was getting to go to trivia. That was it. That was genuinely it. I was not doing things on weekends. Like it was writing, especially while having a full-time job. And also on top of it, I was finishing my degree during part of this too. So it was like full-time school, full-time job, trying to write a book, also have my other books. Holy crap, what am I doing to myself? I feel like in 5 years, I'm just gonna have like a total breakdown eventually about this book. I'm still in a little bit of I'm like, okay. And I'm like, no, it's going to hit me one day. We're like, oh my God, what did I do?
Like it's done.
Yeah. So the thing is, it's like, just always figure out what it is you want to do in this space and just put your love of the genre behind it. Like, and people will follow that. And I've seen it for myself. In terms of like people who like I've watched so many people come up, and now they're like these huge people on YouTube and like doing appearances at conventions or getting to be part of like Bloody Disgusting's podcast network and things like that. There's no magic way in, but I think if you really just put yourself out there in a way where you don't end up with a lot of weirdos, I might add, because now it's a little different. Like people will respond to that. And I think that's just, the internet is so infamous for being a place of where people put on like these airs and like sort of they create these online personas. I could never do it because I'm just really bad at that. I'm a really terrible liar too. So like I just could only ever be me. And for whatever reason, like I've been fortunate for people like genuinely responded to that because I never tried to pretend I was something else than I was. And like, yeah, like I've had journalism experience throughout most of my life, but what I bring to the table in terms of this was just my passion and love for wanting to celebrate it. So just, it sounds so stupid and so easy. And again, totally rambling, but just be yourself. Like, cause that's all that like, I think people genuinely just want to see people be authentic in their love of horror.
That's fantastic. And honestly, I do feel that's really it. That really is it, honestly. And folks, if you're listening, take that to heart. Heed that wise advice there. So I want to end things on a fun note here for you. And you've gotten a chance over the years to see, so many films, like, whether it's an early screening, opening night, or just seeing it just because you have the time to do it at that point. But if you could think back, is there any horror film that, whether you've actually gotten a chance to see it in theaters or not, that you would think you would want to be there on opening night, that you want to go see with the opening night crowd? Is there one horror film that you could pick out that you would love to either relive that experience of seeing it opening night or get that opportunity to go and see it if you didn't get a chance to?
Yeah, like I super fortunate, like through doing festivals and stuff, that I've gotten to have that experience with a lot of like modern horror. So like getting to be in that crowd, for example, for like the 2013 Evil Dead, was ridiculous. It was like a bomb went off in that theater. It was crazy. But on the end, like the total opposite end of that spectrum, getting to see something like A Quiet Place at the very same festival years later, where you literally could have heard a pin drop in that theater because everybody was so engaged and quiet and so dialed in. Like that is the coolest thing. I would say probably, and again, maybe it's just because like I was fortunate enough to get to see a lot of really cool stuff like as a kid. But I would almost, because it's a movie that my mom still won't watch. There was two movies growing up that were like the no-no movies for me. There was very few lines drawn, but the two movies, one was Texas Chainsaw, which was funny because like, honestly, I'd already seen most of it through Terror in the Aisles anyway. So like no big surprises there. But the other one was The Exorcist. And I almost, because my mom to me when I was a kid was like super fearless about horror movies. Like she watched anything, whatever. But The Exorcist for her, she said how she like basically slept with a light on in her apartment for 3 months afterwards.
Okay.
So and I was like, okay, interesting. And I honestly wish I had a time machine so I could go back in time and go with my mom to go see The Exorcist just to see what it was like. Cause I know people were like throwing up and passing out, and it really was like sort of that first viral horror movie experience, and I would love to actually see that in real time.
Yeah.
Because I know there's always been like at Sundance you get like a lot of like, oh, this movie was so extreme. Honestly, I think a lot of that is due to altitude and exhaustion and things going on. I mean, admittedly though, I do remember being at the first screening for Hereditary and watching grown men freaking out and having to leave, or one guy was literally sitting in front of us, and they're small chairs, And he was like hunched up like this, and he had his shirt over his face like this. And this guy had gray hair. Like, he wasn't young, he was an older dude. And I was like, grow up. Come on, man. Like,
Yeah.
it was hysterical. So I genuinely think, like, there's a lot of movies like it'd be really cool just to have the experience, but I would love to sort of see that. I mean, I also think something like Jaws would be really amazing because like that was like sort of the first phenomenon movie. And I like that sort of history of it where it's like that was a movie where people lined up for like 3 to 4 hours just to try to get into the theater. And a lot of days they were turned away because it wasn't like we had the huge multiplexes that we have these days and things like that. So, you know, each city had like 1 or 2 theaters and you lined up and you just waited to see if you can get in. And so that would be really cool too, because I'm sure that would have played like gangbusters.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I'd have to go old school because I was lucky enough to get to see, like, I remember Dream Warriors I saw at the drive-in. That probably would have been pretty fun in a theater with people. But I did get to do Dream Master with people, and that was because it was so like fun MTV-ish. Like it was like a party. And I was only 10 at the time, so I was just like, oh my God, this is cool. Like I felt like I was part of like the cool kids club that day. So yeah, I think I'd have to go old school and do Exorcist just to like be a part of what that was like, because that feels to me like such an authentic, like viral moment where these days when people are like, oh, somebody threw up during like VHS, whatever, I'm like, but why? Like, what is, I mean, I get what it does for the marketing and things like that, but also like how real, because I genuinely believe that people in the 70s were freaking out because this movie wasn't like anything they had seen before. So, so that's like my old school answer.
Okay, I love that. I got a chance. When they did like the re-release of The Exorcist with like the version you never saw, like I think it was 2000, 2001. I saw that with a church group in theaters, which is still the most random church field trip I had ever taken in my life.
Oh my God, that is amazing. I love that.
I was like,
incredible.
as a kid, like I didn't like it made sense, like, okay, cool, it's God versus the devil, and there's a demon, and like, okay, this all ties in. But as an adult, I'm like, that just seems like a very poorly planned trip for a church youth group at that point.
I feel like there might be parents that were like, what are we doing here now? Like,
yeah.
Wow, that is cool. My church groups were never that cool.
Oh man, like it's that, and I tell the story, which is funny because I've had some friends that I've met in like recent years tell me the same thing. But there was like a play that my church had done one time about like Judgment Day, and like demons would take people to hell, but they were dressed in like the Ghostface Scream mask, and I thought that was terrifying because I had just seen like Scream 1 and 2. I was like, yep, demons look like Ghostface. That's more scarier than anything you could come up with to me right now.
Oh my God.
Was apparently hip, I guess. I don't know.
It's funny. We rented a house from my aunt's, the church that my aunt went to when I was in high school. And they had a really cool pastor at that time. His name was Bob Smith. And so he was very much about like sort of engaging with like younger people and stuff. And it was really funny because we were doing like our Christmas nativity thing. And it was right around the time when like In Living Color was super popular and everything. Yeah. And so I remember, and he got like yelled at by some of the people in the church. But so we kind of like modernized the whole story. And he, instead of like being like the archangel, like the regular archangel that you like in the story, he was Homie the archangel and had like the sock and everything. And he was like, Homie, don't play that. And it was just like, it was really funny to me, like being in high school and being like, this guy's super cool. And okay, well, let's do this. But the people like in the church, like when we actually performed it, like the older people got like kind of pissed, but it was really funny. So yeah, that would have been a trip to go with like a church group to The Exorcist. So
yeah. All right. Well, Heather, it has been such a pleasure having you on and getting to chat about your work and just about the world of horror in general. Do you have anything that you want to promote here?
Yeah, I mean, I guess right now, In Search of Darkness, the companion book is out right now. It's a limited run. We only did 1,500, and I actually think we're only at about 170 left.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah, so once this is gone, it's gone. There is probably going to be a paperback edition We're still kind of figuring out how that's going to work, because we don't want to like shortchange anybody, but also like I'm somebody like I'm on a budget, so I get it. So if you're looking for like sort of the cheaper option, hopefully we're going to have something for you soon. In that regard, but you can go to amikpublishing.com and go to their dark ink label. And the very first thing there is going to be the In Search of Darkness book. Also, for anybody who's living in LA, we're actually going to be doing a signing at Dark Delicacies on April 27th at 2 p.m. And it's going to be myself and Patrick Bromley. And then we're also going to have a bunch of special guests out with us as well, including like Joe Dante, Tom Holland, Kelly Maroney, effects legend Steve Johnson, a couple other effects legends, Edward and Stephen Kyoto. We're hoping the third Kyoto is going to come too as well. We also might be having a few surprises there beyond that I can't quite talk about yet. But it's going to be really fun because I know the book is a big ask. So I wanted to give people like, okay, yeah, me and Patrick's signatures. All right, whatever. So I wanted to kind of give it like a fun little extra. So that's why I invited some legends out to kind of come out and just be a part of the celebration. They're doing it all for free just because they love the fans. So if you're out there, you can find that at darkdel.com. And I'm also in the process of wrapping up Monsters Makeup and Effects Volume 3, which hopefully should be out later this year. And then if you're sort of into collecting physical media, I just got to celebrate the release of one of the essays that I worked on for Possessor from Brandon Cronenberg. That's like one of my favorite sort of horror sci-fis of the last 10 years. So getting to be a part of that was pretty cool. And Scream Factory also just announced for Orphan, because they're doing the Blu-ray for that. I actually got to do a commentary track for that as well. So
that's awesome.
It was very last minute. I was coming off of bronchitis too on top of it. So I chugged a lot of Mucinex before I did it. I was like, okay, boys, let's do this. And so like, for me, I was just like, okay, cool. Then we're going to do this. Nobody's going to listen to it. It's like, it's, whatever. And then all of a sudden it was like, people were like, oh, Heather's doing, I'm like, oh no, people are going to have to listen to me now. Like I'm freaked out. Like more so about this than anything that I've done. Cause I was like, oh God, did I say okay things during this? Am I like crazy? But I did get to share my story about when I made Peter Sarsgaard laugh, because he had done SNL recently and it was like the Peter Sarsgaard, which was like a face mask. And we just had a really good laugh over it. So I got to share that. But that was like my first ever sort of one-on-one junket. I'd done some roundtables in LA at that point, but that was my first sort of on camera, me with just talent. So it's a movie that means a lot. And I love Orphan too, and I love the sequel. So
Yeah.
So getting to be a part of that was pretty cool. And I was totally sort of flabbergasted by the response where it's like, oh no, people are gonna have to listen to me. I'm so sorry. But it should be cool. There's also other commentaries too. So if mine doesn't work for you, there's like a couple other ones you can go into as well.
Well, I'm definitely I have it pre-ordered. I am stoked to hear it now. That is awesome because those movies are absolutely fantastic. So I'm definitely stoked to hear that commentary for sure. Heather, thank you so much for joining us here on the show today and your valuable insight. It has been a true pleasure having you on here.
This was like a huge, this was really great. It's funny because I sometimes when you do podcasts and stuff and you're like, oh, you kind of know what the conversation's gonna be. And this was a genuine joy for me because I didn't know, and this was just a really fun way to sort of I was like, oh, I guess I do have things to talk about. Very strange for me. I don't talk about myself that much because I'm just like, it's me, whatever. And so this was really, really cool. And I just appreciate you taking the time because I know people are busy. Like I said, I never set out to be the biggest. So I know there's bigger names out there that you could be talking to. So I just appreciate you taking the time and just being so cool about championing some of this stuff because it means a lot to me. So it's just being able to hear from other folks that care about it too. That's awesome, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was very important to me to get you on the moment you said that you were open for interviews because again, you've been such a prominent voice in this space for so many years now, and can't pass up an opportunity like that at all. And I'm so glad because I know we've been through hell with our scheduling the last month there. I'm so happy that we were able to get it to work out because it really has been a great conversation, and it's funny because I always get nervous before every interview I do because no matter how much like background I've done and how much like research and studying I've done, it's like I'm gonna completely just bomb this. And it has been a joy to get to talk to you today. So thank you again so much for your time and participating in this.
You did awesome. And I'll tell you what, like, honestly, the nerves will never go away. And that's when you know you're in it for the right reasons. Because legitimately, it's funny, even when I have to do interviews for like work stuff that I have to do, like, which is totally out of this realm, I still get nervous before interviews. That means you
Yeah.
care. That means that you're doing the right thing. And I'd love to say that one day it just goes away. It will never go away. But embrace it. Just embrace the fear.
Hell yeah. Yeah. Gotta take it. Gotta take it.
Yeah.
All righty. Well, folks, again, thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. Got more great stuff coming down the line for you. My name is T. We've been talking scary movies. Stay scared.
Is a big fan of Fangoria. So, if you want to check out the world's best horror magazine that's out there, get a chance to get yourself your own subscription, which I just got my first one back in 2022, and I don't regret it for a second. But if you want your own Fangoria subscription, or you like the Fangoria merchandise, then head over to the Fangoria shop and use my link if you want to save yourself some money, folks. That's an easy one to remember. Just go to shop.fangoria.com/AXDEW. Again, that's shop.fangoria.com/AXDEW, or use my specific code AXDEW at checkout. You can save 20% off your entire order, and that implies 2 subscription and one-time orders as well. You don't want to miss out, folks, because with the magnitude of horror movies we've had released in the last few years, and with what we have on the horizon, Fangoria is going to be your #1 source for all that great, juicy, bloody information in the world of horror. So again, head to shop.fangoria.com. Hey there, folks! Thanks for tuning in to T-Watch This Scary Movie. I appreciate you checking out another review or movie news, whether we're talking movies, TV shows, books, or games, whatever, it's all scary. Remember, you can check out new episodes every Wednesday night at 8:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time on the YouTube page for video. That's youtube.com/C/Theron Reynolds Scary Movie. Again, youtube.com/C/Theron Reynolds Scary Movie. And you can check out the audio version on all your favorite podcasting platforms. Just search T Watch the Scary Movie or TWASM. Don't forget, my name is T. We've been talking scary movies. Stay scared.